We're with Dr. Haider Abdel Shafi. We're not in the Middle East at the moment. We're actually in a suburb of Chicago where he's visiting. And we have this opportunity to discuss with him the history that he's in a quite unique position to discuss. What's happened in the peace process, what's happened to the Palestinian people, what's happened between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I'd like to start about 10, 11 years ago, right after the Gulf War.
Sure.
I remember walking the streets of, actually I was sitting with Saab Erekat in the offices of his newspaper with Abu Zulaf, and he got the call to say, he's on the delegation to Madrid.
Uh-huh.
You must have gotten a call in Gaza right around. Saab wanted to know how many clean shirts he had. His question was, could he get his shirts cleaned in time to go to Madrid? You must have got a call about that time saying there's going to be a Madrid conference and you're going to... Who asked you to be the head of the delegation, Arafat?
Well, actually, I got a call at home in the evening. That was when the decision was taken by the National Council to attend Madrid. And it was Nabil Shad who called me from
Nabil.
Tunisia.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that the executive committee wants me to be with the delegation that will go to Madrid. Personally, I was in agreement with the decision to go to Madrid. But of course, I was not involved in politics. I was a physician practicing medicine in Gaza at the time. And so my answer to Nabil was to apologize. And I said, I don't think I'm the person you need for this. And I did apologize. So he left. That night, after midnight, Abu Mazen called me. And he said, look, this is a unanimous decision by the executive committee that you should head the delegation to Madrid. And Abu Ammar just instructed me to call you and tell you this. And as well, I thought as long as I'm not against the decision to go, and now they are pressing on me, and apparently they need me, I said, okay. So I agreed.
But you hadn't been part of the discussions that led up to the decision to go, but you agreed with it?
No, but I agreed.
No apprehensions at all that the Americans had just done what they did in the Gulf? The Palestinians had been made lots of promises over the years.
Yes.
Unless I have it wrong, your delegation was formally attached to the Jordanian delegation. The formality of it was.
No. First of all, let me explain. I mean, personally.
Bring it closer so you get the... Okay.
Personally, as I said, I was in agreement with the council decision to go to Madrid. And my personal reasoning was that we expected that the American government, who is the party that called for the Madrid, would adopt a balanced position regarding the peace issue, the negotiating issue. For two reasons. We did go, in my opinion, this is my analysis, that we didn't want to give the Israelis another opportunity to say that Palestinians don't care for peace, they only know violence and this and that, so they don't want to go to a peace conference. We didn't want to give them this material. And secondly, more importantly, that this call came in the aftermath of the intervention of the Americans in the Gulf under the heading of liberating Kuwait from the Iraqi occupation, which hardly lasted 3 or 4 months. So I said, by all measures, the Americans are so sensitive to an occupation that hardly lasted 3 or 4 months.
I guess they're going to liberate us too.
then they should be much more sensitive. Occupation of 20 years, where the Israelis committed all kinds of atrocities against the Palestinian people. So there was, I mean, a reason for this. But anyhow, so I was expecting that the American government, the sponsor of the peace process, would adopt a balanced position regarding the peace negotiations.
And when you got to Madrid and the conference began?
Yeah, Madrid was a ceremonial, meeting, and it went all right, in every way, and it just ended with these ceremonial things. Things started in Washington, a month after Madrid.
But before Washington, did you talk to Shamir personally there? Did you?
No.
You did not?
No, we did not talk. We were sitting opposite each other, and we looked each other in the eye, but we didn't.
There was no human contact between.
There was no human contact, and Shamir left the next day. He left the conference.
And he left who in charge when he left?
Who was the deputy?
I wasn't there, so.
No, I
did he leave Bibi in charge?
I think the who was supposed to be the head of the delegation, Rubinstein.
Amnon Rubinstein?
His first name.
But it was Rubinstein.
Yeah, Rubinstein.
Okay.
The head of the Israeli delegation, who is the Attorney General in Israel now.
Okay, so he was your equivalent.
Yes, he was not my equivalent.
But you had no contact with the Israelis, you didn't speak to them, or there was no engagement beyond the formalities?
With we sat in a meeting, us as a part of the Jordanian delegation and the Israeli delegation, and we sort of just became introduced to each other, and a ceremonial meeting in Washington, but no discussion, nothing, matter. And then we left Washington, went home, and came back to Washington by the end of December.
All right.
Yeah.
And were you still at that time quite hopeful? The Americans, you thought, were going to do what they'd never done before and truly try to be even-handed and bring this conflict to a resolution?
I certainly tendered the hope until we started negotiations. At the beginning, as the Israelis were insisting that we should be one delegation. So, and we refused. We insisted that we should be a separate Palestinian delegation. And so there was an impasse right from the beginning. And we had what was called the corridor negotiations.
That's right.
You see, until we reached a solution for this impasse. And it was decided that we will become separate delegations, but there will be one Palestinian from the Palestinian delegation that will be with the Jordanian, and vice versa. One from the Jordanian delegation will be with the Palestinian. But otherwise will be two separate delegations.
All right.
And that's where the negotiations started. Now, the first thing that we asked for, and when we started the first meeting, the first session, was that we asked the Israeli side to stop the settlement process in consistence and in respect of the terms of reference, Resolution 242. And so they refused. That was what we talked about in the first session. The next session also we insisted on this. And, Rubinstein is a clever person, so he vacillated right and left. But we remained insisting that they should stop the settlement issue. And finally, they told us, what are you asking us to do? You think we are settling in our own territory. We are settling in our land. So I mean, your request is it is a strange thing that you are asking us to stop settlements, and so we appealed to the Americans, and what's his name, Baker. I think he tried with the Israeli delegation, but they didn't respond. So he came back and he was pressing on us to delay this matter, this request. And I refused. I said, this is a violation of the terms of reference. It deprives the peace process from any meaning. Resolution 242, which is the terms of reference, does not allow acquiring territory illegally and establishing facts on the ground. And so we started into an impasse, which lasted 20 months of negotiations in Washington, D.C.
Well, the whole 20 months,
The whole 20 months.
that impasse was never overcome.
The whole 20 months. My advice, my immediate advice to our authority was that we should suspend our participation in the negotiating process. There was really no meaning to continue negotiations and provide a cover for Israeli violations on the ground. And also, I mean, excusing the democratic world from not intervening. This was a stark violation of relevant UN resolutions, 242.
But it's the same thing the Israelis did at the first Camp David. They used, in fact, I'll give you the interview with Camel before I leave if you'd like to have it. And Camel outlines how the Egyptian delegation tried and tried and tried to get the Israelis to put in writing that as part of the agreement they agreed to end, freeze, whatever word they wanted to use, settlements. And the Israelis continually refused.
Yeah.
The Americans would go to the Egyptians one by one and tell them to put it off or to delay it. And in the end, that's why he resigned. He resigned because he told Sadat, if it isn't in writing, if it isn't clear, Begin isn't going to live up to it. And sure enough, settlements, I'm sure you remember the President of the United States, Carter, went in front of the Congress and declared that settlements were being frozen. And then Dayan said it was all a misunderstanding. They were frozen all right for 90 days. So, but if I may be, people like myself were involved at the time. I lived in Washington. I saw the way the U.S. government was acting. I saw the pressure groups, the lobbies, the competing interests. Wasn't the deed done before you ever got to Madrid? When you agreed to go to Madrid as a group?
Yes.
Without assurances that there would be certain things that would result, the Israelis were home free again. In other words, you could have insisted as Arabs and as Palestinians, yes, we'd like to go to a peace conference, yes, we want to come to Washington, but the Israelis certainly must stop all further settlement activity or we're not even going to take the first step. And many of us thought at the time that the Palestinians were being misled by Jim Baker. I remember he was flying back and forth at the time, and he'd come to Ramallah, and I'm sure he came to Gaza, and he was sweet-talking you Palestinians about the need for a peace process. But those of us who were watching it were saying, why do you Arabs want to go to another set-up conference, which the Americans are holding not to bring about a resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict, but in order to get beyond the Gulf War and to make it appear that they were even-handed? There was no chance they were going to be even-handed.
Well, that probably, this sort of thing was overlooked on our part. I mean, talks with Baker by the PLO, and it was mainly Hanan Ashrawi and Faisal Husseini who carried talks at that time. I remember meeting Baker in Jerusalem during his visit, when he was still preparing for the peace conference. And I remember I asked this question. I said, we are much concerned, the thing that concerns us most is the question of the settlement activity. Is that going to be, and I remember it was Ross, who was not, you know, direct or clear in his answer. But he said something, and he said, sure, this thing is going to be discussed, or something like this.
Yeah, going to be discussed.
Yes.
And
yes.
then they're going to tell you, why should we stop?
Yes. And so, but then when we started the negotiation, actually this is the matter that we insisted upon. And as the Israelis refused, and the Americans couldn't press Israel to stop the settlement, my advice, my immediate advice to our delegation was we should suspend our participation.
Well, the Americans could have. They weren't willing to, and they really didn't want to. However, so your delegation was sitting in Washington for 20 months of impasse. Actually, you went back and forth. You weren't there for those whole 20 months. In fact, how many times do you estimate you were back and forth in that period of time?
Oh, I mean, we had 10 times, 10 rounds.
You were really going back and forth every month or two.
But you know, as I advised our leadership that we should suspend our participation, and they refused, I personally wanted to leave. And actually, in Gaza, I was going to send a message to Arafat, tell him that I'm not going to the next round. And then, you know, Fatah mobilized the whole Gaza Strip to press me to stay on. And that actually happened, maybe. And then the members of the delegation, all of them, combined, pressing that I should stay on. If I don't stay, they are not going to stay on. And so there was this pressure, which now when I look back on this, I blame myself. I say I shouldn't have, you know, stayed on. I should have decided. But you know, it was difficult. You know, there were demonstrations all over Gaza Strip, coming to my office at the Red Crescent, coming to my home, and pressing on me that I should stay on. Now this really, I think this is a matter that proves how the people were very eager and very hopeful that this peace process is going to lead into something. That's the only way I explain it. Why did all the people in Gaza, from south till north, really they made demonstrations from my house that they wanted me to stay on? But I really, I can't excuse the members of our delegation. Anyhow, I stayed on until Oslo was declared.
Well, but what happened? Were you in Washington when you heard?
No, I was on my way to Washington. I stopped in Paris, and actually our ambassador Layla Shahid told me that Arafat wants you in Tunis. I said, never mind, I'll talk to him when I am in Washington and see what's going on. But that night, in the middle of the night, I got a call, and they said there is you are very much wanted in Tunis. The chairman wants you, and there is a ticket for you in the first plane that goes from Paris to Tunis. And so, okay, I went to Tunis, and right from the airport to the office of Arafat, and he handed me the Oslo agreement. So I read it there, and then.
That's the very first you had any idea of anything?
That was 3 days before the, it was on the 9th of September.
But everything had been kept totally secret from you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though you were chairman of the delegation?
Yeah.
Nobody had ever said a word?
Nobody said a word to me. You know, then after I read Oslo and I read the briefing of the meetings in Oslo, it was a condition by the Israelis that the Washington negotiations should continue on. That was a condition by the Israeli delegation in Oslo, that to continue the discussion about Oslo, it was a condition that the Washington negotiations should continue proceeding. I suppose a sort of a cover, added attempt to the secrecy of the Oslo meetings. But anyhow, as I read it, I told Arafat frankly and openly, I told him this is a very bad agreement. It's going to put you into all kinds of difficulties, and you should open your eyes, see. And that's where his first thing he said to me, of course you are going to attend the signing ceremony. That was really, I didn't expect that. That the first thing, when I tell him that this is a bad agreement, he tells me, of course, you're going to attend the signing ceremony. And
Because he needed you. He still needed you then.
When I left Arafat, it was Abu Mazen and Abdel who met me in Cordoba, and they inquired, did you see the agreement? Did you read it? The first thing I asked them, did you have a legal advisor with the delegation? They said no. Really, that was the first question I asked them.
Well, you know, as Edward Said has written, they didn't even have people who spoke English.
They said no.
Right.
And I proceeded to Washington, and there, of course, the press came and asked me about the Oslo Agreement. I expressed my views, and it was Nabil Sha'at who protested. And he said, I can't understand you, Dr. Haider. You always want to keep pessimistic. Don't you see that the Palestinian state is already a reality there? And I really wondered what went into the mind of Nabil Sha'at telling me this. But the fellow who...
We'll come back to Nabil, because this is important.
Yeah. The fellow who next day called me on the phone, it was Ross. And he said, I read your comments about the agreement. You know, when we were negotiating in Washington, and we were, from time to time, we went up to the foreign ministry and discussed what was going on. And I always told, I spoke there and told, I can't understand why this roundabout way about negotiations. You know, we are negotiating on behalf of our political leadership, the executive committee, so why shouldn't negotiations be direct with the executive committee? I said this again and again. So Ross called me, he said, I read your comments about the agreement and you are not happy. But we actually did what you promoted all the time. We negotiated with the executive committee as the thing that you were asking all along. So
in secret, keeping it from everybody else.
In other words, that he was surprised about my comments that this is a bad agreement, which was reached via our political leadership. So I told him, Ross, I insist that this is a bad agreement, but I think it is within your ability, the American government, to see that this agreement works and realizes the needed peace if you want to. It is in your hands.
Did you know at that time who Dennis Ross was?
Well, I knew Dennis Ross. He was the senior, employee there, I mean, next to the foreign minister. And I know that he had a great deal of influence in the State Department.
But those of us who lived and worked in Washington, we saw the Palestinians being set up. Dennis Ross wasn't a government official to us. He was a Jewish lobby representative working with the government. We knew that. You didn't know that.
No.
And because, well, as an example, you have no way of knowing this. Nabil invited me to Tunis in 1990, in the months before Madrid.
Yes.
And I was the PLO's guest for a week, sitting in the hotel like everybody does, waiting to see the chairman, which I really didn't care if I saw him again, because I told Nabil I'd come to talk to him and others and to meet the new leadership in Tunis of the PLO. But on the last day before I left, he brought Abdel to my room, because I finally said, I'm not staying. You know the routine. Stay a few more days, more things will happen, more meetings. And I told him, sorry, I'm leaving. Told you I'd come for a week. I've been here a week. Thanks for all the meals. I had my meeting with the chairman, which nothing came much. He said the American committee was going to meet. 2 of the 3 came to the meeting, and the chairman said, you should meet with him again tomorrow. 1 of the 3 then came. Okay, I'm not very important, but that's not the point. Before I left, we had a shouting match in my room at the Hilton.
Which year was that?
1990.
1990, yes.
Madrid was already in the air.
Mm-hmm.
I had been to Saudi Arabia, where I'd been the guest of Okaz a few months before. Might have even been 91, I'm not exactly sure, but it was before Madrid.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, he brings Abdel to my room. It's the first time I had met Abdel. I knew a little bit about his history. The 3 of us are sitting there. I know that I have to leave in 1 hour to catch my plane. Being American, I could be a little more forthright, and I said, all right, we got a very short time. You're coming at the last minute. I'm just going to say what I think. I told him I think the whole thing is crazy. You guys are being set up. Madrid is a trap. I don't understand why you're going there. I think the whole thing is terribly being boggled. You guys don't know what's going on in Washington. You don't even know who the players are. You have no think tanks. You have no information. You've got this guy Rahman who sits there handing out cookies to people who we all think's a jerk, and everybody thinks is a jerk. Most Palestinians think he's a jerk. And Nabil took me in the hall, and he said, my God, Mark, you're meeting Abdel for the first time. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you more optimistic and supportive? I said, you asked me to come here. We'd known each other quite a while. You come for the last hour. You know I'm leaving. I'm not going to stay. So I'm telling you, I'm making it worth your while. I'm telling you what I really think. I live in Washington and know who these guys are. I knew something was wrong, but of course I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know what would happen at Madrid. I didn't know you at the time. But I did know that the Palestinians didn't have very good information. They had no think tanks. They had no supportive information system. Their Washington operations were pathetic. None of us took them seriously. And that you guys were being set up because it was in the American interest to hold a peace conference.
Yeah.
Just like going back to 1918, the French would hold them, the Brits would hold them, and the Americans would hold them, and each time the Arabs would get screwed and the conflict would get worse. So there were those of us already saying to ourselves, at the time I didn't know you, but I knew your reputation and I asked about you. And it looked like you were being used. You were the distinguished, elderly, uncorrupted. Nobody had any charges against you, unlike the others. Yeah. And you were already, I'm not sure what your age is, but you were in your 70s.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes.
You weren't considered a competitor for power. You weren't going to challenge Arafat directly. So you were a great choice. Very distinguished. Very soft-spoken, but very principled. And these subcurrents were taking place at the time that never intersected with you because, for instance, someone like me was already so alienated from the peace process that I had played my own small little role in with Sadat and the Egyptians when I was a kid. And if I may just tell you one other thing so you see the backdrop to the further discussion here. You'll remember in '82 when Pierre Mendès France and Philip Klutznick and Nahum Goldman made their statement in Paris. Mm-hmm. Well, there were 2 other people in the hotel room at the Hilton in Paris. Issam Sertawi, who was a close friend of mine, mm-hmm. and myself. I was the one who wrote that statement, and they were the ones who put their names to it.
Yeah.
And Issam inspired it. Issam brought them together. He played this fantastic role in bringing everybody together. So while you were down at the Grand Hotel negotiating, people like me were in my office on Connecticut Avenue, not even wanting to go to the press conferences. We didn't even want to be seen there. I remember once going there, and Ghassan, the Al Fajr correspondent, you must have known him, Ghassan Bishara,
Yes.
he came up to me and he said, "Mark, my God, what are you doing here? I mean, normally you stay away from these things." And I said, "Yeah, but you know, I came out this time just to see if it's as bad as I thought," and I left about a half hour later. The Jordanian representative, who's now the prime minister, I think, had gotten up at some press conference and made the most ridiculous, asinine comments about what was happening. All right, so it's 1993, you're in Tunis, you told them right there you wouldn't be going to the ceremony.
Yes.
And they must have been kind of, my impression was everybody was so scared how fragile this agreement was that they wanted to quickly run to the White House and have the ceremony as quickly as possible before people started to find out what was going on.
Yes.
Was that your impression too?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Although I warned Arafat to right there when I read the agreement about it, and actually when I went to Washington 2 days before the agreement, then the same day that Arafat was coming to Washington, I was leaving, and they were, you know, Fatah people, they were irked about my leaving at the time when Arafat was coming, and they said, "Doesn't look very nice when you are doing this and all this," and I didn't care because Arafat was coming to stay in the same hotel as I was leaving, and there were already some people who were coming to meet Arafat, to welcome him to Washington. But anyhow, I insisted, and I left.
You came here, I think. You came to
Yes,
Chicago.
yes,
Right.
I came to Chicago, and then I left to Gaza. But then, seeing Arafat again, I didn't know that Arafat wanted to come to Gaza, really, to come to Palestine. And so I was surprised when I knew that he was coming. And I protested. I said, "Well, what the heck? Why are you in a hurry? Why you can appoint an authority responsible to you in Palestine to see how things go. You don't need to be in a hurry to go to there until you see how things will work." I'm not very optimistic about how things. But then I knew that Arafat was, you know, very decided that he is coming to Gaza. Yeah, but I advised him against this. He didn't listen.
But before that, when you decided not to go to the ceremony at the White House, it must have been a very anguishing and difficult situation for you. And the rest of your delegation didn't support you either. Didn't they all go?
Yes, they did. And that's the thing that I see these days about our situation, about all that's going on, that we have a problem. We have.
Please be as blunt about it as you like.
Yeah. I think all that's going on all along really it just means there is something wrong with us. Yes, that's what I.
Something wrong with you institutionally or psychologically or?
No. I say you know, we were in our negotiations in Washington. We were a united delegation. we were all united delegation.
And you kept it that way.
And
It was
stayed that
right.
way until Oslo was declared. Then, I mean, when I look at it, I always wonder, why didn't anybody else side with me and took the same road? All of them sided with the chairman. So,
Well, they sided with power, with influence, with money, with
so this is the problem. I say this is the problem with us Palestinians, that we are not committed to what's right. We are committed. There is a personal factor that works there. I mean, people would like to be with the chairman, like to be on the side of the chairman, not on the side.
yes, but the agreement was in contradiction to the very principles they all said that they were upholding. I mean, that's what you're pointing out. That
Well, that became evident when I insisted that I am boycotting the delegation in the negotiations in Washington D.C. The pressure didn't come from the people alone. All members of the delegation, also in unity, they insisted that I should remain part of the delegation, and that if I don't, they can't stay on, and this will destroy the peace process and all this. I mean, if they wanted to be with me and wanted me to be part of the delegation, why didn't they come with me when I criticized the Oslo agreement?
the next most famous person on the delegation is Hanan Shafi. Why
Yeah.
didn't she was your deputy?
No, she was the spokesman for the
delegation.
For the delegation. I certainly don't appreciate the way the way Hanan handled itself, because she remained close to the chairman. She attended the ceremony. She said the chairman, he went to the European capitals after the signing of the agreement, and well, that's exactly what I'm saying. There is some problem with us.
And living in Washington and going back and forth to the Middle East, I'll tell you what I think the problem is. You never developed real institutions. You allowed Arafat to keep a guy like Rahman in Washington for 20 years, to spend your money and waste your history. You had no think tank. You had no support system.
That's right.
You had no independent contacts. It was totally incestuous. Hisham would hold a party. You would go and speak. Hisham would invite his friends. Nobody who was critical of anything, most especially themselves, because I have added up the millions of dollars that have been spent in the 20 years by the Sharabi Center, the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and some of the other groups. And I've come up with a figure of at least $25 million that's been spent by these groups, which have accomplished not only nothing, but many of us think minus.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for Hisham as well. And that you say we have a problem. The problem is the incestuous nature of the whole thing. In the States, the same group from American Sami Farsoon,
Yes.
Hisham, Edward, and Clovis. The same ones that set up the AUG are the same ones who are still in charge. There's no new blood, there's no new leadership. They've essentially given each other awards for 20 or 30 years. Everything's gotten worse by the years, and then the moment someone criticizes them, as I have done in writing, and there's a certain amount of bitterness here, the moment someone criticizes them in writing to point out what you are calling the problem, we all of a sudden become the enemy. For instance, Hisham, he'll never admit this now, but I used to go to his house and sit in the early days of 70s and 80s and talk about these things. But the moment I started writing about what you're calling the problem, I never called it that before. And this problem has done you in, because essentially the other side has profiles on all of you, has psychological write-ups about all of you, knows exactly who each of you is, what your relationships are, CIA transcripts, Mossad, they know exactly where each of you stands and what each of your strengths and weaknesses is. They send Dennis Ross to talk, they know who to send to talk to you, they know how to get their way, and they didn't get it with you, but they got it with everybody else, and that was enough. But do you ever feel you made a mistake by not being more publicly vocal? Because had you stood up in the days just before Camp David, just before the Oslo signing, it probably wouldn't have changed what happened, but on the day it took place, except for the small incestuous group, people didn't realize you weren't there. And I'm the only one who said it on national TV. It was not said on NBC, CBS, or ABC. It was said on CBC. And as I told you, I had checked it out because I didn't believe it at first. I thought, one person is not coming, the head of the delegation? And the story I got was, you needed to visit relatives in Chicago. I saw it was a... But you had the attention of the world at the time. You could have held a press conference and you could have challenged them more publicly. You didn't.
Yeah, well, there is a reason for this, that my involvement was all along a low-profile involvement, because, as I said at the beginning, and when I apologized to begin with to head the delegation, because actually I never considered myself a politician. I am a physician. It is true, as a Palestinian, I am very much interested in our political problem and all this. I cannot distance myself from this main problem which bears on our future. But on the other side, I always considered basically I am a physician. I am not a politician.
But you're one of the founders of the PLO, aren't you? Let's go back. You were born in Gaza?
Yes.
May I ask when? It was before. It was before the state of Israel.
June 1919.
June 19. So right after the peace to end all peace.
Yes. Yeah.
And you did your education. If I had to guess, I don't know. You probably went to Egypt for medical school.
No, I went to the American University of Beirut.
In Beirut,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Went to AUB.
I graduated 43.
Okay. And weren't you one of the founders of the PLO in the 60s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I was a member of the first executive of the PLO.
All right. So a little more than a physician here. There's a little political involvement here.
You know, it's actually, it's not. You know, the Palestinian problem, it is not. When I say it is politics, it's not exactly, pure politics. This is a matter that bears on the future of the people. It's
And now the future of the world.
yeah, it's not. When you talk politics about any other thing, this is a matter that goes into the core of the Palestinian future. All this. So doctors or no doctors can be involved, but still, on the other hand, there are people who are specialized. Has no other task or no other duty but the political issue. But for me, basically, I am a physician, and I always remembered what one of our professors told us right at the beginning when we went to the first medical class. He used to tell us again and again, I remember, he would say, any of you who has any other interest other than medicine, I advise him to leave right now, to change his course. Really. We had a German, he was a Jewish professor from Germany, those people who were expelled out of Germany.
Well, those were good days when there was a lot of mixing. Yeah.
And then Dr. Meyer would consider, he was a very little fellow, very short fellow, but he would say it again and again. Any of you who has any other side interest in anything other than medicine, I advise him to leave right now.
But you didn't take his advice.
Well, I took his advice, but I was never involved in political things. You know, until that was 43. I mean, that was actually not 43, that was maybe 38 when I was the first year medical student. And you couldn't tell the future what's going to happen and whatever.
But then 48 happened, and the Egyptian occupation of Gaza happened.
Yes, yes. Anyhow, I actually, worked as a doctor and nothing else during the years of 1947, 48. All my work was. But then, of course, I mean, after 1948, it was a survival of the people. You couldn't separate yourself from. That's why, I mean, we went to this All Palestine Conference in 1964, which established
That's the founding of the PLO.
Yes,
Right.
which established the PLO.
And that took place where?
And maybe that took place in Jerusalem.
It was in Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Oh, sure, before 67.
In
Jordanian Jerusalem,
yes,
right.
Yes, yeah, in Jerusalem. You know, and that's where every Palestinian really, to say frankly, politics. I mean, my involvement really, I don't call it politics. I never aspired to have a political position or something like this. I am involved in politics simply from the angle that I am a Palestinian. I am very concerned about our, future, about our rights, as any other Palestinian.
But the situation now is immensely worse than it was before Oslo, before Madrid.
Yes.
It has gotten worse and worse. The Intifada 1 was an easygoing period compared to now. I was there a lot during Intifada 1.
Yes.
You could still go places,
Yes.
and someone like me was still quite safe.
Yes.
I wouldn't feel safe now, and I understand. The kids have been radicalized, and
Yes.
they've been...
Yeah. Yeah, certainly things have changed a great deal. And our problem, in my opinion, if I want to summarize it in one word, our problem is the lack of organization on our part. And certainly without organization, you cannot achieve anything, you cannot realize anything.
That was the theme of your discussion at the Palestinian Center last month. Because I watched the tape of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But as I watched the tape of it, I said to myself, and please, will you pardon me for being very blunt about it?
Please.
I said to myself, he's giving the talk at the heart of the very group of people who are responsible for the problem he's discussing. These are the people who have raised millions of dollars. These are the people who have the good life in America, in Washington. These are the people who have tenure and pensions from Washington institutions and universities. And these are the very people who have failed to create effective institutions. Instead, misleading everybody into thinking that what they've created is other than a joke. I mean, for instance, we joke privately that Hisham has a lunch society where he invites 50 people and the Arab media gives them a free lunch and gets them to listen to a few people who happen to come to Washington, pretending that they are now an influence in Washington. Those of us who live in Washington laugh at the whole thing. They're not an influence at all. They're speaking to themselves and giving a free lunch to each other and giving awards to each other while Rome is burning. And a lot of Palestinian young people feel the same and don't want to be involved. But I know you're not a Washington person, you're an outsider. You come and you're there for a few days and you're at the fancy hotels, and it may not look so bleak to you, but nevertheless you're saying your problem is lack of institutions, lack of effective means to compete politically as well as in other ways. But what, if you can identify the problem, then you should also be able to identify ways to deal with the problem. And I didn't find that in your speech.
I don't know, I don't recall, I didn't have a written speech really.
But you talked a lot about the lack of institutions, the need to organize ourselves.
To better organize, I think, I mean, this is really the main thing. I always say the disarray that prevails in the Arab world at large is the absence of democracy. This is the cause that the Arab world, in spite of all its possibilities and all this, that they are in this situation is why should it be like this? Why aren't they in better situation? They have all that is there, that's needed to be much better than what they are. It is the absence of democracy. The absence of democracy means the absence of organization, of planning, of set scale of priorities, this, that, everything. And this is the same thing with the Palestinians. I claim that we have some potential, but we are not doing anything to be able to make benefit out of whatever potential we have. And that's because of the absence of organization. Our problem is the lack of organization, that things are done,
haphazardly
and without organization. And that's, I always say, I say one thing, the Israeli worry starts when we start to organize. The moment we start to organize as Palestinians, it will be the beginning of the Israeli worry about the future. But as long as we are in this situation, disarray, they are not worried about anything.
Let me ask you about Issam Sertawi. He too was a doctor, younger than you, but he gave up his medical practice in '67. Did you know Issam?
No, I didn't know him
You didn't know him personally.
No.
He was becoming a heart surgeon with Michael DeBakey, the famous still Michael DeBakey in Houston.
Yes.
'67 came, and the heart surgeon became a fighter, guerrilla terrorist, depending upon who's.
Yes.
He was one of the commanders at Karame. And then, of course, he became the PLO representative in Europe.
Yes.
I met him in '75 when he came to Washington to set up the PLO office. He and Sabri Jurius came. And then they were kicked out by Rabin and Kissinger within 24 hours before they were going to announce the establishment of their office. But the reason I ask is, Abu Nidal just died or was killed. And you say the Israelis would have to worry when the Palestinians begin to be effective and begin to be organized. Abu Nidal's organization was used to kill a lot of Palestinian leaders, the most moderate and the most capable, Issam among them. He had told me before his death that he believed Mossad was infiltrating organizations like Abu Nidal's, keeping them going, even providing the money if they needed it, and planting the idea who they should eliminate. That's, from the way you're shaking your head, you say that that's a possibility. That's
Sure.
And you had democracy when you established the PLO originally. Even in the 80s you had quite a bit of democracy. Arafat's rule wasn't a one-man rule at that time, but it became more and more a one-man rule. And Nabil, interestingly, Nabil was the guy who called you from Tunis to ask you to become head of the delegation, and then you made all those comments you made about what Nabil said to you. It may be more than your lack of institutions and the haphazard decision-making. It may also be that you've been infiltrated by various people whose personal interests and allegiances are not necessarily what they say they are.
Certainly. This is so.
And the one most important person who has led Arafat down the path that he's gone down is Nabil, isn't it?
I don't know whether it's Nabil alone. I think it is in his blood. I mean, Arafat's personal ambitions is the problem. And so you know, when it is that
His
bad,
personal ambitions to be the center of attention,
yes,
and to be in charge,
certainly, yes,
but
it is so.
but his ambition was to be the president of Palestine before he dies,
Yeah,
and
that's his
he
plan.
has forfeited. He has. That's no longer available to him, is it?
It's not by his choice. It's
Well,
not-
but by his policies.
It's not available to him. Well, I mean, it's.
He could have declared a Palestinian state many times and gotten most of the world to endorse it.
Where? Palestinian state.
Well, there wouldn't have been, the Israelis wouldn't have agreed. If he would have declared it 3 years ago, before the turn of the millennium, if he would have declared it,
They did declare a Palestinian state in 1988. But what came out of that? I mean, unless there is a physical, thing to show. I mean,
so he was just outmaneuvered along the way.
Yes.
Okay, but let's go back now to '93. We know what happened at Oslo, and we know that you weren't at the White House. You then went home to Gaza, and were the people glad that you hadn't attended the ceremony? Were they upset that you hadn't gone? I mean, you then became a member of the parliament, I think, within the next couple of years. The Ramallah Legislative Assembly that was set up. Didn't you? Well, '93, you went home in October or November.
Yes.
What was the feeling when you got there, and how did you feel having...
Yes. After Arafat came, there was the Palestinian Authority, and they were conducting negotiations about implementation of Oslo and all this. I remained critical of Oslo, and I was expressing myself, frankly, whether in the press or in declarations and all this. And certainly this was resented by the chairman, that I continued, to raise my voice against Oslo. And of course the most thing that I deplored and criticized is that under the cover of negotiations to implement Oslo, Israel was actively engaged in settlements, and also added to this the bypass roads to the benefit of the settlers and the army, which destroyed the demographic continuity of the Arab environment in the West Bank.
Plus,
and turned it into a Bantustan.
Plus, you now had Area A's, different from Area B's, different from Area C's.
All this, and all this came in the aftermath of Oslo. And
with Rabin. That was Rabin doing
Yes,
that. Yeah.
but that, my criticism did not prevent me from standing for elections for the Legislative Council, which came in the context of Oslo.
Right,
And-
that's what I was asking about. Right.
And that's where Chairman Arafat actually, on the occasion, it was the meeting of the National Council in Gaza, and I expressed myself about Oslo, and Chairman Arafat was angry about my comments in the National Council, and he said, I really wonder very much how people like Dr. Haider is always, on every occasion, he is critical of Oslo, and then he engages in some element that comes in the context of Oslo. He means the elections, that I stood for the election. And I answered, of course, I said, in spite of the fact that the election process came in the context of Oslo, still I did not hesitate to stand for elections in the hope that we are on the way to realizing a Palestinian democracy. And that's why I wanted to be. And anyhow, of course, later on, as no democracy was established, I resigned from the Legislative
Right.
Council.
So in '94 you were elected.
In '96.
Was it '96? It took
Yeah,
that long
yeah,
for the
yeah,
election?
Yes,
Okay.
in January '96.
Then the council started meeting,
Yes.
and at first attempted to assert itself
Mm-hmm.
and tried to have some real reason for meeting.
Yeah.
But
It
it,
has.
but it never worked. Arafat refused to let it.
Yeah. Arafat did not respect the decisions of the council, and so we were. What to do about this? That's why I resigned from the.
In '97, was it?
In '97, yes, I resigned.
Isn't that around the same time that the council issued its public statement about corruption in the authority? And if I don't speak Arabic, so I'm always a victim of what's translated and what I'm told. But didn't they call for cleaning up the authority and removing Nabil Shah? Didn't they single out Nabil Shah as corrupt and call for his removal from the authority and indictment?
No, they actually it was the what do you call it? The employee in the government that that looks over how things are going, ombudsman or
Ombudsman.
whatever. Yes.
You had an ombudsman?
Yeah, he published a report about corruption in the government. So this report was taken up by the Legislative Council and the Special Committee.
You were still there?
No, I was still there.
Okay.
And the committee got the report and discussed and investigated things, and they came up with conclusions supporting the report of the ombudsman, and even adding to this about corruption in the authority.
Mm-hmm.
And this council report was neglected, and that was that triggered really.
That was the final straw for you. But I do want to understand this point about Nabil. I was told that the Legislative Assembly had singled him out, mentioned him by name in this report, called for his removal from positions of authority in the Palestinian Authority, and his indictment on corruption charges. Now, maybe I was told wrong, but...
No, I can't really make any comments on this because when the committee did not publish its report, it remained a secret.
Or given to the chairman?
Yeah, it was
privately
given,
given,
yes,
right.
it was given to the chairman. And as the chairman just put it aside, that was the thing that I put my resignation
All right, so 97, you've done your second major resignation in a sense. You left the Legislative Assembly realizing that it was not for real and had no power. It was just being
Yeah,
used.
it was sidelined completely.
All right. And then in the years 97, 98, 99, before Intifada 2 broke out, before Camp David 2, what was your role, if any, or were you sidelined? And
Well, after I left the council, I didn't have any official positions in anything, but I remained as an interested Palestinian citizen.
well, a little more than that. I'm sure everybody was coming to you asking you what your...
expressing my views about what's going on. And, excuse me. Hello.
Because now we're getting into the current situation, which has gotten so horrible and so... did you happen to see NBC News a night or two ago where Martin Fletcher went and interviewed the Shabab group that assassinated the woman collaborator?
No.
It was very moving. He went to the house of the collaborator. I'm assuming she was, but maybe she wasn't, the woman.
Where is this? Is it in Gaza or in Nablus or in
I think Hebron.
Hebron? Yes.
It was the first time the Shabab had assassinated a woman in this way. So the NBC cameras went to the woman's house. She has 7 children. Not unusual there, but one of a 19-year-old son had been taken by the Shabab and had been beaten because they wanted him to tell about his mother. They believed that his mother had given the Israelis information about how to assassinate a leader of their movement. They got the son to say that his mother had done it. They went to her home. They took her. They videoed her confession. And then at 3 in the morning, they took her to some place in Hebron where they shot her in the heart 3 times. And Fletcher courageously, because I know things are very difficult now, he got the Shabab to agree to be interviewed on camera. And he went into their, I'm sure it wasn't their headquarters, because I have had meetings like this in the past too, and they choose at the last minute where the house is going to be, and they just hold a meeting there. But he got on camera the leader of the Shabab who ordered the assassination and who explained why he ordered it. And then he pointed to another person in the room. Of course, they're wearing keffiyehs and you can only see their eyes. I think they have no idea that your eyes are enough now. That's all that's needed to identify who you are. But it was very moving because, for me especially, I've interviewed people like that in Nablus and in Hebron. These kids are 19, 20, 21, 22. They've known nothing other than occupation, nothing other than brutality. Their commanders are being killed. And they wanted to send a message to Palestinian society: we won't tolerate people collaborating. But nevertheless, for the average American watching that, it was the lead story, the lead 3-minute story on NBC News, even before Bondar's visit to the ranch. Your society has been totally radicalized. The new generation has none of the contact and none of the civility of the old generation. They have no positive interaction with others. Tourists don't come. It's difficult for journalists to come. Where do you find... Well, rather than asking it that way, what's ahead?
Well, it's really the main challenge with us is how to organize, how to make benefit of whatever potential we have. This is the main issue. This is the main problem. And certainly this is not easy to say, but it is the only way that we can get out of this impasse where we are is to find a way how to benefit from whatever potential we have. Wherever, now it is a big, a big failure that so far we have not managed to realize a good information service in Europe or in the United States to counter the Zionist, information.
You don't even have a bad one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have one at all.
I mean, isn't this terrible? I mean, we have articulate people like Hanan Ashrawi, like this, like that, and to fail to do anything like this really is indeed is very, and so that's what I mean by our problem really is the lack of organization. Had anybody actually here when I meet with Arab people here, I always say, I mean, people should not wait what the official person is going to do, what Arafat is going to do. People could, on their own initiative, do something that can provide an example for serious and positive work. And that's really where what we need to do. I cannot underestimate the terrible situation that we are in, and I am very pessimistic for the short term. But for the long term, I always say I need not to be pessimistic. If we start organizing, then there is no worry about the future. I think it will be the Israeli worry if we start to organize.
Yes, but the Israelis doesn't the next year or two isn't transfer in quotations, what's the logical outcome of what the Israelis have been building toward? Aren't they just waiting for more attacks against them? And for the war in the Gulf and the war against Iraq, aren't they just waiting for their moment to?
And that's exactly what I mean. When we start organizing, it means that we will cease to provide the Israelis with pretext for what they want to do. As a matter of fact, up till now, while the Intifada is a genuine public response about our problems, about our situation, it was left to drift in its emotionalism, in its spontaneity, and so it's been providing pretext for Sharon and all this.
But every time leaders in your Palestinian community try to hold things back, Sharon then does something further to make it emotionally impossible for people to not fight back.
So
the history of this is pretty clear.
So the blame is on our emotionalism and our inability.
No, under your circumstances, anybody. The Israelis clearly have won the propaganda war, and they've clearly won the war to brand opposition to their occupation as terrorism. You've lost that war. And
not necessarily. I mean, they could brand this, but certainly we are providing them the reason to say this. But if we
you're talking about Hamas? You're talking about the quote-unquote radical groups?
I'm talking about our Palestinian general management of our own affairs. I mean, For instance, I mean, with this intifada, the intifada is an emotional, spontaneous act. It's genuine. Its message is okay. It's good. It should be respected. But that does not mean that we stop and just look on. And, I mean, the failure of not attending properly to the intifada to limit its spontaneity and lack of organization and really organize properly, this is the problem.
But isn't it, seriously, isn't that too late? The younger generation is now already deeply underground, deeply organized by itself, deeply committed to the struggle, using tactics that the previous generation would never have considered okay. They've been provoked and provoked, they've all been tortured, they've all...
Yes.
I mean, I don't see any way that people like yourself are going to be able to control those in their 20s who are primarily the ones doing this leadership, especially when the Israelis are going to provoke... I mean, there's no secret what Sharon's goal is. Sharon's goal is to have the pretext to destroy all Palestinian opposition and to remove as many Palestinians because the birth rate is still too high. He's going to try to get rid of them. Maybe even to northern Iraq. I've heard all kinds of... I thought they were crazy rumors at first when people started coming to me saying that when Iraq is coming apart, there are plans to put a lot of Palestinians in northern Iraq. And I thought at first this was crazy talk, and then I started hearing it from people who aren't crazy.
But that was the thing that was contemplated at the inception of Zionism. I mean, to find places for
Whisk them away.
For the Palestinian people. It was Iraq, it was
Sure.
Syria,
Right.
it was Syria, and these were contemplated by many Zionist leaders before the, I mean, as early as the first Zionist conference, and all such methods were contemplated to pave the way for the Zionist claims in Palestine.
But aren't you more worried about it now than ever? Aren't we closer to it now than ever?
It all depends on our performance. I think if we really start organizing, if we realize unity among the Palestinian political forces and really realize a unity that will make it possible to organize properly and benefit from our potential, then I think it will be Israel that has to worry about the future. I really am.
But organizing takes time, leadership, and money. The war in the Gulf is coming in the next 12 months. The Americans are very committed to it. The Israelis are pushing for it very hard. Maybe it won't happen. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. Even the people in charge don't know what's going to happen. But all indications are the American military will move into the region, will change regimes, first in Iraq, then if necessary in other countries, including Saudi Arabia. Last night I had dinner with the former Pakistani information minister. He went to Georgetown in Washington. We've been friends since we were students.
Mm-hmm.
He's recently met with Musharraf, who wants him to come back, but he doesn't want to go back into government. But this was the first time I ever heard Mujahid say that now we think the Americans have gone crazy, and we know that one day they may come to Pakistan as well. Meaning that when the Americans finish in the Gulf, the idea of an Islamic State with nuclear bombs and missiles called Pakistan is also on their list of places that need to be dealt with. In this case, the removal of the weapons of mass destruction, which the Indians, the Israelis, and the Americans all want. So in discussions I'm having with people, but I don't hear it from you, there's this great anxiety that a Sharon government at a time of regional war, unprecedented confrontation, total American support, what's going to stop them when the bombs are falling from bulldozing Dheisheh and Jenin and other camps because the terrorists are there, and from pushing people across the Jordan or relocating them in a place that has no government? Iraq. Where? I'm surprised you're not more anxious about this right now.
Well, all what you say really underlines the importance of organization on our part. The only way to counter all such, contemplated things and measures is to organize. The only safe way to guard against all this is to be able to organize properly.
But to organize, you have to have credible, capable people, and they have to be given substantial resources.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Washington, Rome, the heart of the empire.
Yeah.
I don't see in Washington today, all I see in terms of organization is more of the same crap that got you into this problem. And instead of sending someone, they're finally sending someone to replace Rahman, but they're sending Hana Zenora.
Is it so?
Yeah, that's what I'm told. Now, Hana may be he's less corrupt and he's more gregarious, but he's a lightweight.
I was early after Oslo, and I was talking to Hanan Ashrawi to accept to be the head of our office in Washington, D.C., but she was not interested, and Abu Ammar.
There's no question that Hanan Ashrawi has a way with language and a credibility beyond the others. But it takes institutions, not just organization.
Sure.
You have to have, the Israelis have the Near East Institute. Mm. And now Dennis Ross, the guy who all you Arabs were talking to all these years, no shame at all. A few weeks after he finishes being ambassador for 11 years or so for the Americans, where does he go? Right back to the Israeli lobby think tank, and nobody bats an eye. And then you may not know, do you know where Martin Indig is?
No way.
Oh, they gave him his own institute.
You what?
Yeah, they gave him his own institute.
Yes.
Dennis was now at the Near East Institute, and they didn't want Martin not to have a place, so they got a wealthy Jewish person to give money to the Brookings Institution, and they set up the another think tank at the Brookings Institution that Indig is the head of. Mm-hmm. And when the Arab leaders come to town, when your delegation came to town last month, who do they go to hold lunch for them and to invite the important people in Washington? They go to Martin Indig and they reward him and allow him to. It's worse than the fact that you're disorganized. You actually, your forces work with the enemy and reward exactly the wrong people. You should be boycotting the Near East Institute. You should tell Ross he's an asshole for having lied to them all these years and you don't want anything to do with him. You should tell Martin Indig that, you may not have known who he was before, but you gradually figured it out. He can't keep deceiving you year after year after year. Those of us who watched this in Washington, we were laughing all these years. We said the Israeli lobby has taken over the American government's positions all the way from the National Security Council to the State Department. And the Arabs keep negotiating with the Jewish lobby, thinking that the Jewish lobby is somehow going to change its positions. I, being Jewish myself, don't have anything to do with Martin Indig or Dennis Ross. I know who they are, and I know what their game is. That doesn't mean they're not effective. That doesn't mean, but on your side, you're now going to send poor Hana Senora to oppose this. There's not a prayer. He's going to, by the time he gets to Washington and starts holding meetings, so we're at a crucial moment in history when the Palestinians are literally being killed every day with tanks and F-16s and American weapons, when the American president is lying through his teeth. I mean, the idea that he's the first president to talk about a Palestinian state. What about Jimmy Carter in 1979? Every American president since Carter has called for either a Palestinian homeland or a Palestinian state. The idea of boycotting the talks, that makes a certain amount of sense. But don't you think time, hasn't the clock run out here? Aren't you now facing not just occupation and brutal military apartheid-like restrictions? I guess I'm trying to, obviously you don't agree with me. I think an attempt to remove some of the camps and remove many Palestinians is coming in the next year. And I don't see any defense against it. I don't see that your society is prepared or able to stop it. The Arab world isn't going to help you.
I certainly cannot belittle or underestimate the terrible situation that we are in. But at the same time, I say, if we really, it looks like it has to be a miracle, but really, Palestinians finally get to just look in and look at things clearly. It's not difficult to realize or to decide what is needed to do. And if we do what needs to be done, I think we'll be on the road, and nothing of the things that you are predicting can be realized.
I'm going to accept your theme rather than mine, because I'd like to share with you about some people and about, you don't know this, and I believe you've met her. And when she was back home in recent years, she couldn't say much about these kinds of things. Did you ever meet Muna Hamza, the Palestinian journalist?
Muna Hamza?
Right. She wrote Refugees in Her Own Land.
Yes.
She's also the woman that back 12 or 13 years ago went on Israeli TV and caused a big stir. There was a British documentary made about her talking to the enemy. You
No, I think, but...
okay, but she doesn't even know I'm here.
Where is she now?
Well, she's here in Texas, and if I may, I'd like to tell her of today's discussion and encourage her to give you a call before you go back. She's in Texas at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I mention her is the following. First of all, Hanan speaks such good English because her mother, Muna's mother, taught her English at the Friends School in Ramallah, Wadia Abu Daya.
Yes.
And Wadia Abu Daya married, I forget exactly all the connections, but one side of the family was related to Hassan Shukri, the longtime mayor of Haifa.
Mm-hmm.
And Muna and I met in 1984 in Washington. She had come to Washington to save the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
So she was representing the National Association of Arab Americans. She was the press person for NAAA, which was another terrible story, but she didn't know it, and she was being used by them at the time. She and I met, and we were married for a number of years, and so we're very close. I didn't expect it to come up here, but since your emphasis in both your speech in Washington and today is to look in the mirror and say our problem is organizing and our problem is defending ourselves, you're right, I feel time's run out. I feel that we're already on the edge, and that I've watched Arab society as opposed to Jewish society for a long time. Jewish society holds meetings, makes phone calls. Next week something happens. Next week there's a new institute. This happened in '83 when they set up the Near East Institute. It came out of nowhere. Your society takes a long time for new things to get set up, because the old people, I'm not referring to yourself, I'm referring to some of those names in Washington that we've already mentioned, they just won't get out of the way. And they just sit there and sit there and sit there giving awards to each other. But Muna is one of the most, Muna and I are not together. That I'm not, this is not about me, it's about you Palestinians. But you should see this at least.
That makes the Israelis worry about the future,
Yes,
basically.
the Israelis are traumatized. They're traumatized by their own history. The analogy that I give is the Japanese had nuclear bombs dropped on them, and you could see the scars on their bodies. The Indians and the Pakistanis went through the partition, and I have some very close Indian and Pakistani friends, and when they really talk about today and nuclear war and Kashmir, the partition and the millions of deaths is still very much a part of their psyche. We Jews never recovered from the Holocaust. Our souls are still scarred. We're frightened about everything. Not so much here in America, but the Israelis. The revisionist Zionist movement is our fundamentalists. They're not religious fundamentalists, they're political fundamentalists. And, well, as an example of how the Arabs aren't organized, in '79, apropos to today's interview with you, I was in Cairo interviewing Boutros Ghali 1 year after Camp David. He was the Minister of State at the time. He was their intellectual. He was supposed to be their man of knowledge. And I asked him the following question within the interview. I said, did you at Camp David, did you understand you were not dealing with labor Zionism, but you were dealing with revisionist Zionism, and that Jabotinsky is their mentor and their guide? And Boutros looked at me. I could tell he didn't know who Jabotinsky was. Yeah. So I repeated it, and then I explained who he was. And then I said to myself, holy mackerels, these Egyptians went to Camp David. Boutros, their top theoretical, historical man, they signed an agreement with Menachem Begin, and to this day they still don't even know what revisionist Zionism and Vladimir Jabotinsky are. And when Sharon became prime minister 2 years ago, who was the picture on the wall? It wasn't Herzl, it was Jabotinsky. So the Israelis are terribly worried, but they're worried about many, many different things. The right wing is worried that their dream of a Jewish state, the rebirth of a Jewish ethnic political state, requires apartheid and requires destruction of the Palestinian society. Because even with all the hardships, you guys keep overpopulating. We don't understand it because you can hardly feed them, but you keep populating. And it's not really a religious thing. It's not that you don't believe in birth control. It's that you just believe in having lots of kids. They're terribly frightened by that.
Are you now talking about the Israeli Palestinians, or who are you talking about?
No, the regular Palestinians.
Yeah, but then
The Israeli Palestinians too.
Is the real problem. I wonder, how do you think Israel is going to manage with that?
The indications are clear. They're going to polarize the two societies so that at some point they can remove as many of them as possible. The way they wanted to do
How
it,
could they?
the labor people wanted to do it by getting you Palestinians to agree to live on reservations. You could call it a state and you could fly your flag, but essentially you were going to be put on reservations. That's what Oslo was. There would be the Ramallah reservation and the Jenin reservation. And you could call it a state. Arafat you could call it a state and have UN membership, but you couldn't have real independence because the control of your boundaries and the control of immigration and the control of the airspace and the control of all the key things was going to be kept under Israeli domination. But if you guys would have agreed to reservations, then Israel could have solved its population problem, because it was going to push more and more of you onto those reservations, let you call it a state, but then the percentage of Jews in the Jewish state would be higher and higher and higher rather than lower and lower and lower. So for them, Oslo was the way out. We won't kill them all, we won't expel them all, that's too difficult. Besides, we're the inheritors of labor Zionism rather than revisionist Zionism, and there's too many American Jews who wouldn't understand it because they're paying a considerable price. American Jews aren't sending as much money as they're supposed to send. But that failed because, you know, maybe Rabin could have pulled it off. Not that he was interested in you Palestinians, but he was slimier and craftier and more subtle underneath. Even Yossi Beilin didn't know what Rabin really was planning. Mm-hmm. But with Barak and the military, your situation is now bordering on hopeless. Your friends have deserted you because, not you personally, of course, your friends have deserted because of all the corruption, all the ineptitude, all the incestuousness, all the nuttiness. Now we can't even visit because we don't know whose head they're going to slice off next. And I understand, you know, when Robert Fisk was beaten up and almost killed in Afghanistan, the next day he got up and he wrote an article saying, if I were those refugees and some British guy who they didn't know ended up on their, ended up in their village, I would have beat them up too, just to show them that we hate you guys. But you ask, are the Israelis are polarized now. I interviewed Professor Reinhardt last week, Tanya Reinhardt from Tel Aviv University. She's demoralized, she's depressed. She thinks not only is there going to be transfer now, she thinks the Israelis are preparing for a war with Syria, that the Israelis are going to use the excuse of the war with Iraq to attack both Syria and Iran and to remove, if they can, all the ballistic missiles, all the chemical weapons, all the nuclear plants, to buy themselves another 10 or 20 years of time at least, and then to help the Americans dominate the region through force and the CIA. And she's been right over the years. She's got her ear to the Israeli military political establishment. She knows very few Palestinians. Because it's been very hard for Israelis, even the really good Israelis, the really dedicated Israelis, the Israelis who have suffered a lot in their own careers and their own friendships, it's been very hard to establish trusting relationships with Palestinians. And believe me, because of Muna, I'm much more aware of, Muna's on her own now. She doesn't even know I'm here, and I wasn't sure I'd bring her up. But with your continual mention of the need to organize and the need to defend ourselves at least by reaching people with our story, you can't do it from the people who control the money in the States. Hisham is used up. He's finished. All he knows how to do is hold a party once a year with hors d'oeuvres and 2 lunches a week that he has to bribe people to come to. The same people who he gives a free lunch to. There is no think tank in Washington. There's no power center in Washington. You have no spokesman in Washington. Sami's no better. Sami's, he introduced you at the Sami Farsum. Clovis essentially represents the Arab League and doesn't want to give up his little position of being asked by the media. He's fantastic rhetorically and politically a complete and total failure. Edward doesn't know what hit him. He's a brilliant academic. You can't fault Edward. I mean, his writings, his contributions, his oratory puts him in a class all by himself at the intellectual level. But at the political level, he's part of the total failure. He's part of that circle of people who have spent 30 years and have nothing to show for it except the same group of people that they started with 30 years ago. People like Muna don't want to be involved. I'll let her tell you her own stories. She might even be mad that I'm raising this with you, but I'm desperate too. There's another person I'm very close to, Professor Ahmed, Hisham Ahmed, teaches political science at Birzeit. He's blind. He says he knows you. Do you recall him because he's blind? But here's a guy who was born in Dheisheh refugee camp. He's in his mid-30s. He was born in a cold tent. You know the story. He was born practically penniless. He and his brother were both born blind because their mother didn't get the right nutritional things, and she had a certain genetic makeup, and so anyway, he's totally blind. Meanwhile, he taught himself perfect English. He speaks English like he was raised here. He got a PhD in political science from the University of California. He teaches political science at Birzeit. I could have never overcome any of those handicaps. Any one of those, and I would still be in Dheisheh having coffee all day. He overcame them. He's in Ramallah now. I speak to him usually every week. He's not totally demoralized, but he's a very capable person. He's been a Fulbright scholar, but because he opposed Oslo right from the beginning, he's been pushed aside, and they're even trying to give him trouble at Birzeit, where, as you know, you don't get paid for teaching at Birzeit anyway. You have to kind of pay them between the transportation charges and everything. There's a certain amount of prestige, but it's a hardship to be a professor at Birzeit. These are 2 people I know personally. They are both immensely talented. Muna she's older now than when she was chosen to be in the British documentary. She's very charming. She's very articulate. She's very committed. And instead of using her, for instance, you say we're not organized. Her book came out, Refugees in Our Own Land. It's the story about Palestinian refugees from someone who lived in a camp. Beautifully written, so well written that when the chief editor of Le Monde Diplomatique read the essays, he called her, he'd never met her, and he said, I want to publish these essays in our newspaper, and I then want to make a book, and I'm going to write the introduction to the book, and he invited her to Paris, and the book's been published in French. And I've said this to some of my Palestinian friends in Washington. I said, if I were Hisham Sharabi, I'd be down on my knees begging people like Muna, take this money. Here's $25,000 or $50,000. I want you to go to as many universities, as many social groups, as many places around the country. If you need more money for transportation, tell me. After all, we've got an $8 million endowment that don't tell anybody about it, but you know, we've kind of raised it from people. I'd be on my knees begging her to go do this and speak up. Instead, I'll tell you the story, and if she gets mad at me, well, she'll just get mad at me. She was supposed to speak at Hisham's Institute about a year ago. And she called me and she said she's be in Washington, and she told me why, and I said, all right, you know, I'm not going to say you shouldn't do it, Muna, I understand, but you know what I think about this. So I was expecting she was going to come. A day before, she calls and says she's canceled. She told them she doesn't want to come. I asked her why. She says, Mark, I can't take it anymore. They said they want me to come. They want me to spend 3 days in Washington. And they're going to give me an honorarium of $400. And the ticket they're giving me isn't even direct. I'm supposed to fly into Newark and then get another flight because it's cheaper to do it, you know. And then, no, she just, and these stories are commonplace, that your own institutes have not only not done what they should do, but they've alienated the very people from your own community. And why? It's not by accident. I'm sorry to be so blunt about it. I'm not sorry, but not comfortable really, because I'm not a Palestinian. The reason is because they want the limelight. They want to be called by MSNBC. Clovis wants to appear on TV. They want to control who gets invited, and they want to control what is said. And they can't count on people like Hisham or people like Muna to say what they want said, because they're independent people with minds of their own, with convictions of their own. They might say something that's politically incorrect. They might name names. They might talk about the $25 million that's been wasted over the last 20 years. They know a little bit about what's going on in the States. And the best example of this was Robert Fisk. 2 years ago now, when the Al-Ada people got started, right of return people, which was itself a division in your community. They broke away from the ADC crowd and the other crowd wanting to have their own organization, so they had their own organization. So they invited Robert Fisk, who I assume you may know personally, might have met at some point.
No.
Okay, but the correspondent for The Independent.
Yes.
Very courageous, very thoughtful guy. They invited him to 2 of their meetings that started in Boston as one of their featured speakers. The first one, he came to Washington after, told me the story, we're laughing about it. He said, my flight was delayed. I came in early in the morning. You would have thought someone would have met me at the airport. They would have checked to see that the flight was delayed, or at least that they would have told me where my hotel was. But instead, I arrived, he said, at 2 or 3 in the morning. There was no one to meet me. I didn't even know what hotel they had arranged for me. So I simply went to some hotel and the next morning went over. Okay, that's one thing. Unforgivable, just unforgivable. The next time he came, the next year, he gave one of the main speeches at their conference, and he raised some of the issues that you're raising, about how disorganized the groups are, about the need for this, coming from someone of his credibility. All that he's done, all that he's risked, all that he's written. And I'm giving you, look, I believe these things to be true. I wasn't there. In the audience, it wasn't just that he was heckled by some of the organizers, but someone I know was sitting in the part of the audience where Edward was. And Edward started bad-mouthing Fisk, saying he shouldn't be speaking publicly like that, he shouldn't be raising these things like that, why did the organizers let him? I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it happen time and time and time again. And the reason is because the incestuousness of these groups and these persons, they don't understand how ingrown they are. They don't understand how, I don't know what other word to use, but incestuous they are. I'll give you another example about Edward. This one was personal to me. There was a professor at Columbia, Professor Charles Black. I might have his pamphlet. Charles, for 40 years, taught international law at the Yale Law School. In 1989, with the Intifada raging, he, Sterling Professor of Law, Yale University, teacher of Bill and Hillary Clinton, decided he was going to write an essay calling for an end to American support for Israel. Copy of the manuscript comes to my desk. I read it, I call him, and I say, we've never met. I went to NYU Law School. This is a fantastic pamphlet. Who's going to publish it? And he said he hadn't, he'd written it, and he would get it published, and thank you for calling. I told him I thought it was going to be hard to publish it, and two, that I was really worried that if, in order to get it published, the editors would require it to be whittled down quite a bit. Oh, goodness. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is actually an important story. So, 6 months later, Charles calls back. Thank you very much. And he says, I thought you were rather brash to call me and even suggest that I was going to have a problem publishing my article. After all, I've published for 40 years now, and the Yale Law School has even devoted a whole journal to my... And he said, but come to New York, because it turns out you're right. First time in my life, I'm retired now, first time in my life I write something and no one will publish it. I went up to New York, we became friends, we actually published it as a pamphlet. Okay, here's the kicker. Edward gets up at a meeting in Washington, waving the pamphlet, complimenting Charles Black, courageous professor, published by Mark Brzezinski in Washington. We need to do more of this, fantastic. Okay.
Did you grab us some sweets?
3 years later, Dr. Abdel Shafi,
Is that okay?
I asked Charles, have you met Professor Said yet? And he says, no, I'd love to meet Professor Said. I said, you live on 116th Street across from the law school at Columbia University. Edward's office is about 2 blocks away, and his home is just In other words, your circles had never even taken the trouble to call this guy, who's right next to him, and invite him out for a cup of coffee. Those kinds of things, over a period of time, that creates the following conclusion: that morality aside, and right and wrong aside, getting involved with the Palestinians is a crazy thing to do, because they can't even meet each other, not to mention they don't even know the difference between their friends and their enemies. They're off going to lunches sponsored by Martin Indig, and Edward can't even walk 2 blocks across the street and take the very guy who's written this pamphlet and he's told everybody about in Washington for a cup of coffee. Thank you for laughing about it, but it's...
Well, I think yes, you put it in a exactly when I say it's the lack of organization of things, putting things in order is our main problem.
But may I be so bold as to say that if you would provide a book with your credibility and your experiences, and then the kind of criticism and the kind of suggestions. I don't know of any other Western, when I say Western Palestinian, I mean someone who speaks English and who's traveled and been here a lot. As you know, most of the people in Gaza have never been out of Gaza, and never will get out of Gaza, probably. You must have thought about a book of your own. You must have thought about summarizing your experiences and your conclusions, have you not?
Yes, well, many people talk to me about this, and come back to saying that I never considered myself a politician. And so really it's
But it's more important that you're the Palestinian personality. Actually, politicians, the best books aren't written by politicians. But it's maybe more important than you realize. Who in your generation is there to look to other than yourself? Who's been involved in these things? Who does the next generation of Palestinians, or 2 generations down from you, have to look to at this point? They despise Arafat. They think Nabil's working for the Americans, and I think I've reached the conclusion that they're right. Abed Rabo's a sellout. Hanan made too many mistakes and wasn't really very popular anyway. She's very credible and she's very articulate. Issam was assassinated, and Issam was a giant. I mean, look at Issam. Issam had people like Mendes France and Goldman and Klutznick doing what he advocated. And I should also mention to you that one of the reasons I've stayed involved, and one of the reasons I've done controversial things, is when Issam was killed in 1983. He was assassinated because of things he had done in the last few years, and those were things that I and others and Phil Klutznick encouraged him to do. Issam did not want to endorse the Paris Declaration in the way it was done. He was very happy with the Paris Declaration. He was thrilled with it. But he wanted to write a long statement about Palestine resolutions and about this meeting and about this. He had a very elaborate way that he wanted to respond to it. And the Jewish leaders refused. They wanted a clear, we endorse what you've said and we agree with it. And I was with him the morning that we went to Le Monde, and he was going to drop the whole thing. And also, that was the biggest mistake of my life. I just mentioned it to you. Issam and I should have ordered a private plane. We should have taken the 3 Jewish leaders from Paris to Beirut. They were willing to go. The reason they didn't go was because when Arafat sent them the message responding to their declaration, which he did immediately because Issam arranged it, it was in Le Monde the next day, 5-column headline. I know why Arafat did what he did. He sent a message about our struggle, come, see the camps, see our refugees, see what's I know why he sent that message. But what they were looking for was, these were already guys in their 70s, Mendes France or 80s. Mendes France and Goldman died within months. They wanted a message of high diplomacy. I, Yasser Arafat, chairman of the Palestinian people, welcome you to Beirut. Please come. I look forward to meeting with you. Instead, they got this message about the camps and the suffering and the shells and the killing. Okay, but the fault was mine. Issam and I should have said, Issam should have said, Mark, if you'll get them to the airport, get a limo, bring them to the airport, I'll have a plane, we'll take them there, they'll shake hands with the chairman, they'll attempt to change history. That was our moment to change history, and we failed. Just like I was a little critical, maybe you could have held a press conference opposing what was happening at the time that all the cameras were focused on you. Okay, we failed in Paris. And we failed because we thought we had accomplished so much with that statement. Islam called it the Balfour Declaration of the Palestinian people. He said, the Balfour, he was just the foreign minister of Great Britain, writing a private letter to someone. Here you've got the founder of the World Zionist Organization, the founder of the World Jewish Congress, the former president of France, the former Secretary of Commerce of the United States, all signing a statement saying, talk to the PLO and establish a Palestinian state already, Jesus Christ. But we had no organization. We had no follow-up. The World Jewish Congress met the next morning and dissociated itself from what its two founders had done the previous day. We weren't even able to get it published in the States. So it was a terrible failing, and we missed our moment. And it was, having missed that moment, I'm more sensitive now when how few these moments are and when they come. And the same thing was discussed with Mujahid last night, who, by the way, would like to meet you sometime. And even, I know, of course, you're not looking for another jet trip somewhere, but he's no longer in power in Pakistan, but he knows of you, of course, and he's very knowledgeable about the Palestinian conflict. And you've probably never been to Pakistan or Kashmir.
No, I never been.
Is it of interest?
Yeah, I really regret that I neglected going. I didn't go to the east beyond Iraq. Never been to any.
Never to India or Pakistan?
Never to India or Australia or China. Yeah, but
Would you still be interested?
Yes, I really am. Although I am now old.
Well, now you have to get first-class tickets and a little extra comfort to make it worth going, right? Well, if you get a call, I'll tell Mujahid we'll be seeing each other over the weekend. He's a very thoughtful guy, but there too, your organization as Palestinians needs to go beyond yourselves.
Yes.
There are Pakistanis. There's plenty of Jews who. But who are the ones, your movement goes to two kinds of Jews. It goes to Naturi Karta crazies that none of the rest of us have anything to do with. I mean, we consider them kind of funny people wearing things that we, even the most religious of us have never seen before. And the other kind you go to are the professional anti-Zionists. The Elmer Bergers, the Alfred Lilienthals. Now, these were thoughtful people. And they were even courageous people, but they had no political following, and they had hardly any Jewish following.
Elmer Berger is still living? Or?
No. He died, I'd say 10 years ago.
I met him when I was with the delegation of the negotiations in Washington. I met him.
Okay, maybe it's 5, 6 years ago. He came up. He lived in Florida then.
That was 92.
I think they gave him an award. One of the Palestinian groups gave him an award in Washington.
Yeah. But isn't it very, overnight, all his colleagues left him, Elmer Berger.
It didn't happen overnight. It happened over about 15 years.
No, in 1967, up till 1967 and the war.
Okay.
His colleagues were there with him.
That predates me, right. He set up something called American Jewish Alternatives to Zionism, AJAZ, and they had an office in New York. He never had a large following because he was very intellectual and because he was very ideological. He also failed to develop that institution. He and Lilienthal failed. They wrote good books. They were interesting. Many of their prophecies turned out to be accurate. but they never established viable, lasting institutions. And I guess what it's more a plea than a suggestion. Someone has to step in and clean house a little bit and establish one viable institution, information service, think tank. It needs an endowment of between $5 and $10 million. But the way the Palestinian movement has spent money, that's not even big numbers anymore.
Yes.
Hisham, it's not supposed to be known. I know it's supposed to be a big secret. He's got an endowment of almost $10 million. He does nothing with it.
Yes.
Except he pays expensive rent.
Where do they get this money from?
Retiring Arab businessmen and people who in their will want to do something good for their people, so they leave money, because Hisham has created, if you don't live in Washington, if you live in the Arab world and watch Al Jazeera and listen to the people who come visit, and you ask, who should we give money to in Washington? Give money to Jim Zogby and the American Arab Institute. Give money to ADC because of all the good work they're doing. Give money to Hisham Sharabi because he's set up a lobby called the Palestinian Center, and it's really having a force in Washington. Of course, it's all a lie. Zogby is a PR hack paid by the Arab regimes to represent them, who is despised and hated by most of the Palestinians I know. They want nothing to do with him. ADC is a laugh that each year the number of people that come to its annual conference goes down rather than up. And every 2 years they have Edward come and give them the pep talk, and then nothing happens. We all know nothing happens. And as far as Hisham's little center, if Hisham were spending a couple $100,000 a year, wants to have lunches, wants to give out awards, I'd say fine. But instead, Hisham is spending huge amounts of money and time, reaching the same 50 people every week.
Yes.
and thus it's a disaster. And I'm pleading with you that
Thank you.
This is good.
Fine.
and these look like they're from the Middle East.
Yeah, it's more or less Middle Eastern
Shukran.
business.
Oh, shukran. Right here in Chicago?
This one.
This? Okay. Thank you.
I don't know, maybe some in Chicago or some. But they managed to get it anyhow.
You know the restaurant I like the most in your country?
Huh?
There used to be in Beit Jala, the Beit Jala chicken restaurant. You drive up the hill and you get to this little chicken restaurant there. Right, you liked it too, right? But this is not a restaurant with tables and chairs. This is just sort of an outdoor little place where you can sit on a little stool, and the chicken was just killed, totally fresh, with tremendous spices, and everything is just so fresh, and you can hear the mosques. Yeah, the Beit Jala that's now gone.
Yeah.
But you couldn't have had too many diplomatic parties at that restaurant. It didn't have the right atmosphere. But the food was so good. I spent a month living in Beit Jala with Hani Abu Daya, because Muna was related to him. Her mother was an Abu Daya.
Yeah.
So we lived on the hill and could see Gilo coming. You know, even then it was obvious that Gilo was coming. Oops. But those were hopeful days. Those were, but to get back to your theme. I know, for instance, you know, I realize I'm pushing Luna here, and not even with her permission, but the times are so desperate. You've got to invest in people. You've got to help these people, your best people, your most independent people. You've got to get them involved, and you've got to give them the resources to be involved. That's the secret of the Israeli Jewish lobby. I call it the Israeli Jewish lobby. They invest in people. They give them large salaries. They give them pensions. Even when they get in political trouble, remember Steve Bryan? Even when the FBI investigates them and says they're going to put them away for being spies for Israel, they wait 5 years, and then they make them Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. And the word is out. If you work for the Israeli Jewish lobby, and if you do what you're told, you'll be secure, you'll be well paid, we'll take care of you, and you'll always not have to worry about it. It's the opposite on your side. The word is out. Nobody protects anyone. No one cares about anyone. No one even knows for years what happens to different people. And we're not the only people who are well paid are Arafat's cronies. Everybody else is treated like a beggar. And so it creates an atmosphere of despair, and your best people run for it. And if someone doesn't, I'm not saying you can change it on your own, but I know of no other Palestinian leader. There's no one else to turn to. I knew that I had this additional reason for wanting to see you. I didn't know how the conversation would go, and I didn't know what you would raise, and when you kept raising the need to organize and the need to reform, then I realized you were right, but it has to be done in a credible way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I must admit that these nutty ones are my favorites. Thank you. Are you looking forward to getting back to Gaza?
Yeah, it's already, I've been here for too long. It's only my wife who's been pressing me to stay on. But we have to go back.
She's here with you.
Yeah, she's
And this is your
it's my daughter.
daughter?
Yeah.
And how many other children are
From my relatives, it's like other Palestinians. I have a sister older than me. She is in California. She and her husband and child. I have two brothers, one in Houston, Texas.
Oh, they're here too?
Yes.
Hmm?
And one in Florida. Those are all residents in the United States. So it's only me and my brother, my younger brother, who are in Gaza, and our children. Yes.
I remember, I call them the good old days, when the only place to stay in Gaza was Marna House,
Yeah.
and where Mrs. Shava would serve dinner.
Resolution, and everybody would be committed to a resolution.
But Arafat had already lost his independence, hadn't he? He was already dominated by the Americans, and he was already with...
That's more reason for this. That's more reason. If Arafat is, as you say, and there is more reason for this national unity leadership, where all political forces are engaged in decision making, which can be reached democratically and then everybody is committed to regime. We still continue to promote this.
Yes,
And
but
we are badly in need of it.
you're terribly in need of it, but how can you have it when your own authority is infiltrated and manipulated by the CIA? And, I mean, you don't have an independent authority.
But that's the more effective way to counter the CIA or whatever. I mean, this situation of disarray that we are in is the thing that is making room for the CIA or whatever.
Yes, but didn't they agree in Washington last month that now the Egyptian secret police and the Jordanian Muhawarat are coming?
Even I mean, taking all these things together, we continue to badly need a unity. And that's what I say, unity that get all political parties, all political forces have a say in decision making. And then you can't have Hamas act as it wishes, or the PFLP acts also as it wishes, or this or that. You have to have unity of
But do
decision.
you really believe that's now possible? This kind of unity after what your society's been subjected to, and after the infiltration and collaborators, and I mean, I don't think it's possible.
Certainly it would have been much easier before, but we still continue to need this, to be badly in need.
Who's going to lead it?
It
takes leadership.
Yeah, well, it leads itself. It is as I said, I mean, what you decide is the outcome of real, clear debate among all political forces, and you reach resolution in a democratic way. What more than everybody is committed to.
Yes, but as a goal, I understand that as a goal, but I'm distant now. I used to come at least a few times a year. Now I haven't been there since '97. So I'm distant from the on the ground situation. But the impression I have is that the Israelis are pushing for civil war, that the society has fractured into pieces, that the level of hate and hostility has risen beyond what would have been imaginable even 10 years ago, that the Hamas is playing into Israel's hands, but for understandable reasons, and Sharon is waiting for the next huge attack and waiting for his moment to bring the bulldozers and to do what he did in Jenin 100 times over. And he's prepared the world for it now, because the pictures of bulldozers destroying homes, of F-16s dropping bombs, of tanks shooting shells into cities, those pictures are now commonplace. When we see them, we're no longer surprised.
Yeah.
And who's going to stop him?
Well,
I don't see anybody.
The only way to stop them is really to realize the needed organization among all the political forces in the Palestinian scene. There is no other alternative. This is the thing that is needed, and I believe if we finally, and I hope shortly, we can realize this, then that's where we can make a stop to what Sharon wants, and we stop providing pretexts for Sharon and all.
But you asked me before about the Israelis, and I think here's where you've also, as a group, as a people, you've made a major, major mistake. Israel is also polarized. There is a certain segment of the Israeli society which is crushed psychologically and morally by what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
people whose names you may not know, but writers like Amos Kinnan, TV personalities like Dan Almagor, professors like Tanya Reinhardt, reformed politicians like Miron Ben-Isti, who took him a long time, but he finally realized that it was apartheid. And Zvi Barel at Haaretz, certainly Amira Haas at Haaretz. You've got a whole segment.
What do you think of Pepe? Ilan Pepe?
I don't know him. I don't know. The professor. Yeah, I don't know him.
Yes.
I did know Simcha Flapan,
Simcha Flapan, yes.
and you must have.
Yes.
But now, contact among people is even gone. You Palestinians could have mobilized a whole segment of Israeli society, and I don't mean Yossi Beilin, who I believe is sincere, but his Zionism is much more important to him than his politics.
Yeah.
And there was a good example of this in Washington recently. Beilin came with Abu Rabo. I know them both from the past well. I mean, Abu Rabo not well, but personally, from that encounter in Tunis. So they hold a meeting at one of the big synagogues in the suburbs. 70 or 80 people come. Not a lot for two people who are so supposedly important. 99% liberal Jewish members of the synagogue. One blackface, a friend I brought, she came. No Palestinians that I could see in the audience. Still total polarization. They gave their speeches. There wasn't much enthusiasm. There was a lot of skepticism. They pleaded, of course, that we were so close after Camp David with the Taba talks, and we just needed more time. Yeah, right. But the thing that was most interesting to me was, on the way out, I had the camera there, and it took a few minutes to complete it. So I just happened to be walking out when they were walking out. I hadn't really planned to see either of them, because it's too demoralizing. I just don't believe. But the thing that was interesting was, the reason I knew that they had no power and that there was no future is neither of them had any security. I walked up to both of them, put my arm around them, from behind even, because they were ahead of me, said, "We've come a long way, Yossi, you're now talking to the PLO, and I'm not." And I said to Abu Rabo, "Well, I'm sure you remember our little encounter in Tunis years ago, in the good old days." And they both smiled and a little chit-chat, but nobody even prevented me from coming up. There was no security around either of them, which in Washington means you're not very important. Nobody's expecting much to come of this. Your day has been had. But Yossi, I think Perez and Rabin used him. They wanted to get certain things out of the Palestinians, and they used a guy like Yossi, who was in the end on their team and in the end under their domination. Of course, he's now come out a little bit, but what could he do when his mentor becomes the foreign minister for Sharon? I mean, what was he supposed to do? He doesn't have the strength of character or the charisma to lead an alternative movement. But you Palestinians certainly haven't helped the Israelis. If you're going to organize, you're also going to have to build a coalition that involves liberal, progressive American Jews and Israeli thinkers and academics.
Yeah.
Guys like the poet, you had a huge, Natan Zach, does the name mean anything? He writes Hebrew poetry. He's Israel's poet laureate. One night I met him in New York. We were just getting to know each other. We spent 2 hours crying. He was telling me the history of the conflict and his own involvement and why he writes his poetry. Very pro-Palestinian state, very pro-Palestinians. Here's Israel's poet laureate. Every kid in Israel knows who Natan Zacht is. He didn't know any Palestinians, really. He didn't feel that he could visit these places. When I tried to make some suggestions, he looked kind of nervous and hesitant. But it should have, this is your job. You guys should have had institutes that met. And instead you've got Sari Nusseibeh out there doing it, and we all don't want to be seen next to Sari. Maybe you don't want to be seen next to Sari. Well, I can't thank you enough for today. I wanted to find out the story of your involvement and why you did what you did. And believe me, at the time and even now, it impacted on people. People who knew realized the message you were sending. But nevertheless, we all still wondered, why didn't you send it more strongly? And why didn't you actually challenge them, put them on the spot publicly, let the whole world know that the chairman of the delegation, you probably thought that the very fact that you're not there would be its own statement. But it wasn't.
Yes, well, you know, these things, often I feel very frustrated, because just take like this, as a negotiating delegation in Washington for 20 months, we were very much united. We were all one block. Come Oslo, and then, as I told you.
You expected them to stay united? You expected them to?
Yes. Yes, I thought so. We felt so very strongly about the issues we were negotiating that I thought, okay.
So you thought by making your stand, others would follow, that you didn't have to hit them over the head?
I made my stand because I believe in this stand. It's a stand that I can't adopt any other stand. But to me, this is a logical stand. It is in consistence with what we stood for during 20 months. And then something like just came, and because it is promoted by the chairman, then everybody leaves and goes with the chairman. This is terrible. This is scandal.
And I don't want to take away the importance of what you did. But nevertheless, the moment was missed, because if your delegation would have stayed away, if Hanan would have stayed away, if Arakat would have stayed away, then other ambassadors might have stayed away. And they might have even had to reconsider whether to hold the ceremony. It might have unraveled.
Exactly.
And something I've always wanted to ask. I was told the following, but again, it's so hard to believe, and you don't know who to really believe. I was told that when Arafat went into the White House, met with Rabin and met with Clinton, that he volunteered, he was wearing his holster, that he had said that during the ceremony, as a symbolic gesture, he would take from his holster, of course, I guess he was also saying, you're going to have to allow me then to put it in the holster, and hand to the president. Symbolic, of course, that we are turning away from violence, blah, 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 blah. But that it was the Americans and the Israelis that talked him out of that, all realizing that that was too much, that would go beyond, the symbolism would be too much for the Arabs to bear. Now, did you hear anything like this?
No.
Okay. But you were gone, of course, and you were...
Yeah, I was.
You've never heard anything like this?
No.
All right. I can't confirm the story. I wasn't there. It sounds... But then again, Arafat is so nuts sometimes. Well, may I ask Muna to give you a call? Muna Hamza?
That's okay, it will be a pleasure to talk to her.
Well, I'm suggesting a little more than that. I think you need to meet. And
Does she ever come to the area over there?
she can't come
Palestine?
anymore. The Israelis told her not to come back.
Mm.
She misses it terribly
Mm.
and wants to come. But as you know, things have now reached a point where people are being accused of all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But and I'll also tell Dr. Hisham of the conversation we had. And
Hisham Sharabi.
oh no, I don't talk to Hisham Sharab anymore. I don't need to tell Hisham anything. Hisham wants to hold lunches and dinners, and I'm sure he wants to get a big award for
Which-
having founded the
which
Palestinian
Hisham- which
sector.
Hisham?
No, Hisham Ahmed,
Hisham Ahmad.
the blind professor.
Ah, yes.
He's very astute
Mm.
and he's very committed.
Mm.
And he tells me that he goes on Arab TV a lot and speaks up. And he's very thoughtful and very knowledgeable, and he's only in his mid-30s.
Mm.
But I guess I'm pleading with you that if you don't help these people and encourage these people and find some resources, Hisham, he's very proud. He never asks me for anything, and if I had it, I'd give it to him, but I don't.
Yeah, I
These
think,
people are having trouble paying their phone bills. They're
Yes,
having
I
trouble
think-
eating.
I think Hisham you are talking about, I think I know him, and I think I was together with him in his seminar in Germany in some place.
Well, he was a Fulbright scholar. He did
Uh-huh.
teach political science here, yes. But there too, you don't have a mechanism for, if you're part of the Israeli lobby in Washington, you could go to a couple of offices and they'll have files on everybody. And you can read up, this person is so-and-so, here's his background, here's his associations. On your side, and I'm actually on your side, so it's our side, we don't even, there's no place to go, there's no place to trust. The more independent we are, the more cut off we are. And, well, I'm making this plea, and I admit it's a plea. We don't know each other very well, so the emotions aren't coming through here. Many of us are also anguished, in tears. I sit at home, I watch the evening news. Sometimes I don't, I tape it, because I can't take it anymore. But there are many evenings I watch the stories and just cry for a few minutes. And many people are doing that. The anguish is terrible on the Jewish side as well. But how can we be more royal than the king? How can we speak up against the very things that the Palestinian leadership continually is agreeing to? And if your alternative leadership doesn't speak up, then we can't, because we lose all credibility. How can we be more pro-Palestinian than the Palestinians themselves are appearing?
Yes.
And set up one institute in Washington, hire 2 or 3 of your best, these lawyers you're sending around, they're okay, the guy and the girl that are on tour. They're okay, except they're not really talking about politics, and they're not independent. They're talking about the Oslo peace process and the Camp David, trying to counter the Israeli view of what happened at Camp David. They're articulate, they're knowledgeable, but they're not really credible because everybody knows they're hired by the PA. And everybody knows that they're not free to really speak their mind. But they're still much better than anybody else that used to come. And when it comes to Hannah Senora, maybe you could suggest when you get home that he really turn the job down, because he's not up to it.
Just what you've been suggesting a little while ago, are you suggesting a Jewish Palestinian organization?
I wasn't, but that would be even better.
Mm. I often thought about this, that a Jewish Palestinian organization that can promote ideas and even solutions.
But not so much an organization as, and not a lobby, more a think tank.
Mm.
I hate to use their models, but since they've done such a good job, I've always said the Israelis have a terrible case to present, but they play their bad hand of cards so well that they end up winning. Palestinians have a great case to present. They were dealt great political cards and propaganda cards, public relations cards, Hasbara cards, but they play them so terribly as if they don't even understand the rules of the game. So a think tank whose job it is to exploit the op-ed pages, to go on television, to go to all meetings that are taking place about the Middle East, but they have to be not just credible people, they have to be charismatic, they have to be articulate, they have to be tough when necessary, and all the better if you could combine it and make it, you don't have to limit it to Jews and Palestinians. You can have some Christians involved too. They've got a say in this, not to mention that, what, 1/10 of the Palestinians are Christian? But it won't happen unless someone like you steps up and says, I'm going to help set it up, I'm going to serve as its chairman while I can, I'm going to oversee it and protect it. It's like a plant. It's got to be born and then it's got to grow before it will be able to stand on its own. And another failing of mine, which is why I'm making the plea to you, for 10 years I was Phil Klutznick's assistant. Most of those op-eds he wrote, I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
But Phil developed Alzheimer's 10, 11, 12 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and then he died 4 years ago. And we never were able, we missed our chance. I was too young. I didn't understand the need for new institutions. Phil was already so far out there. We were already so busy doing what we were doing. And also, in fairness, I never felt he was going to do it. I never felt he was going to set up a political think tank to oppose the Israeli lobby, even though he had told me, here's Phil Klutznick, Klutznick Museum at B'nai B'rith is named after him, the only man who's been president of B'nai B'rith and World Jewish Congress. In the 10 years I was his assistant, meeting him almost every flight when he would come into Washington, arranging his meetings, including with Hassan Rahman, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
He met with Issam, loved him, and I had the greatest time when Phil arrived in Paris for the World Jewish Congress meeting, and I purposefully didn't tell the Jewish leadership what flight he was on. Instead, he was brought to the Hilton Hotel by the head of the PLO. Issam went to get him. Okay, so he met once with Rahman. Phil had one lunch with Rahman and told me he didn't ever want to see him again. Just didn't like him, didn't respect him, didn't think he had much to say. Okay. Point being, however, Phil told me he thought the Israeli Jewish lobby was the most dangerous and harmful thing for American Jews. And never once in the 10 years that I arranged meetings for him did he ever ask to meet with them. But it was my mistake not to plead with him to set up a foundation, to set up an institute, to endow it with a certain amount of money, and to give it the kind of leadership that would allow it to plant itself and grow. It can't, the political winds are so strong against this kind of thing that unless strong people are there to get it started, it will never get started. It'll be co-opted, it'll be taken over, it'll be twisted. There's a long history of this. And nobody on the American scene, let's see if that's true, nobody. I know of no Arab or Palestinian leadership in the States that has the ability to set this up and make it work. And if you can't set it up in the States, set it up in Europe. But obviously I'm not saying I should be involved with it. In fact, I shouldn't. I'm too opinionated and too outspoken. But Muna, Hisham, Hayat Alvi, who teaches, here's this Muslim woman. She's the youngest professor of political science at University of Cairo now. She's a very close friend. Had dinner with her last week. She's articulate. She's charming. She's beautiful. She's knowledgeable. She's totally independent. And she ran away from Washington as quick as she could go.
What's her name?
Hayat Alvi. She's professor in Cairo now. You've heard her? Heard her name? These people are out there. She's not Palestinian. She's Indian Muslim. But very knowledgeable about the conflict. Very committed to values. So these people are academics by personality. They're much more mild, but they're tough, and they've got integrity. But you or the collective you would have to set something up, call it the International Middle East Institute, call it something. Merle Thorpe tried to do this, and he failed terribly. Did you know Merle? Foundation for Middle East Peace?
I didn't know him personally.
Merle put $8 million into an endowment, had a lot of courage. He went to Arafat in '82 and was in his bunker for a while the shells were falling. And then after his death, instead of the Institute staying independent,
What's the name of the thing that he used to issue?
the settlement report.
Yes,
They still issue it.
yes.
And it's useful, but not $8 million useful. Maybe not even $800,000.
Where did it go, the $88 million?
They took it to the Middle East Institute, the institute that I call the State Department oil company think tank. They put a plaque on the front of the building saying Middle East Institute, now located here, Foundation for Middle East Peace, now located here. They gave it an office upstairs. They took a certain amount of its money, and all it does is issue this report on the settlements, which in itself is useful. The information is available elsewhere, but they summarize it and put it into a nice newsletter. But that's not really controversial. That's informational.
Yeah.
The rest, they don't do very much. And the whole thing, Sharabi was involved in that too. He and Merle were quite close, actually. But nothing came of it. So, and you're at your age, I'm at my age. The people we've been talking about are a little younger than me. This may be the last time we will get to talk, which is why I am pleading, as I said. I know you come here once a year at least, and, but my own involvements may take different turns. I don't plan to come. I came many, many, many times. I do miss it. I do miss Jerusalem. But the reason I'm not going to come is not because it would, not just the safety issue, that's another issue. But if I come and if I have honest discussions with Palestinians, I'm totally gloomy and I'm preaching disaster lies ahead. That only demoralizes them more, and I go back to the hotel feeling terrible. But if I don't tell them what I really think, then I feel also terrible
Yes.
because I wasted their time, I lied to them, we misled them about how bad things are. You can just pop out the battery compartment.
Should be right.
And I just have one more couple of questions. There you go. Just,
I see.
it should come out, doesn't want to. There we go. And the other one just wants in. But anyway, I'm going to front one more time for, obviously I have a great deal of affection for Muna, but I also know, I saw her in front of the camera. I saw what she did in that documentary. I saw what happened when she met with Ezra Weitzman, and General Tal, the tank commander, threw a party for her one night. I've seen the anguish in her more deeply than anyone else, and she desperately wants to do something, but every time she has tried, the very institutions that should be on their knees begging her to take money and do things have mistreated her and abused her. And if nothing else, maybe you haven't seen her book, Refugees in Our Own Land. Very powerful, very passionate.
Is it available?
It's available.
Yes.
It's not the kind of book they have any, came out last September. So unfortunately, even though there's supposed to be 1 or 2 copies in each of the bookstores, often there's not, and you have to order it. But if nothing more happened, then she was sent from university to university, from civic group to civic group, to talk about being a Palestinian. By the way, her English is flawless, even though she was born there, and that's because her mother was an English teacher who taught Hanan Ashrawi her English. So, but her Arabic is flawless as well. She's both Christian and Muslim. That's why she developed the way she did, because her mother was Christian from Beit Jala and her father was Muslim, which I think gave her a different psychology and made it possible for our relationship to blossom as it did. But she's just someone I know. I know there are more. I know there are many more. But for some reason, your institutions never bring these people in. Your institutions always bring in those who are on the take, those who are looking for handouts, those who are looking for jobs and money. There are stories about Hisham's hired a guy 15 years ago who then went to a dinner party about 6 months after Hisham had hired him, showing off his new Rolex watch and talking, I've forgotten his name, and talking about his vacation trips to Honolulu. This was during Intifada 1. And we laugh about it now, but imagine what that does to committed people who exactly. So thank you not only for the interview and for the discussion, but for allowing me to make what I'm now calling my plea. Your people deserve so much better.
Yeah.
And this whole thing has now reached a point of insanity. And I fear it's going to reach a point of the bloodshed that's coming is going to make it impossible to reconcile for generations. And something has to be done to stop it. And when we met 20 years ago, that 5 of us in that hotel room, those 3 Jewish leaders who were your age at the time, they knew something had to be done to stop it. And they reached out with their historic statement. But they failed because they too didn't leave behind institutions and didn't leave behind effective means to propagate their views. And now the situation is much worse, potentially catastrophic, potentially world war. I mean, would anybody be surprised if the subcontinent, Taiwan, and the Middle East all explode in the next year or two and we face conflicts of a kind we haven't dealt with ever, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
And let me give you my card.
With Bush at the helm.
Oh God, that's a whole nother story. Yeah, Bush and Condi and General Powell turns out to be our savior. Yeah, it's funny. May I give you 2 more tapes, which I obviously brought. I'll tell you what they are.
Yeah.
May I give you 2 more? You watch
Sure.
them in Gaza?
Sure.
Okay. One of them, I brought them for you too, because I know you want them. One of them is 2 documentaries that a group of Jewish people made that I led during Intifada 1. We made 2 documentaries. They're semi-professional, meaning they were showed on TV. One is called Palestinian Statehood. It's 30 minutes. The other is called We Dare to Speak. It's 60 minutes. Palestinian Statehood is the story of why there should be a Palestinian state. We Dare to Speak, I sent a camera crew around the country to speak to about 10 Jewish professors, lawyers, Holocaust survivors, and interview them about why they opposed what Israel was doing and favored a Palestinian state. And unfortunately, it's not Hollywood. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar production, but it's a credible production, and and we put a lot of effort into it. So that's a copy. And this is a documentary that was made in Canada about the American political scene. It's very powerful, it's very funny, it's also very true and very important.
Thank you.